I regret we're unable to take any more questions, so we'll now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 4061 in the name of Derek Mackay on the consultation on the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. I would invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, that is, having made certain that their cards are in place and also that their microphones, which are directional microphones, are pointing towards their face. And I would now call on Derek Mackay to open, if you are ready. Minister, you have 14 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am delighted to be leading this debate today to highlight the current exploratory consultation on our proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. I will set out why this Government believes that it is a crucial element of our legislative programme and why the consultation provides a real opportunity to shape the proposed legislation. I will cover what I mean by community empowerment, why should this Parliament be debating community empowerment now, and why does this Government believe that the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill can make a real difference to the lives of our fellow Scots. Can I say at the outset I welcome the Labour amendment, which we are minded to support. Presiding Officer, just as we believe the people who live in Scotland are best placed to make decisions about Scotland's future, so too it follows that local communities are best placed to take decisions about their future. This Government has a track record of delivering policy and financial approaches that allow local solutions and local decisions to flourish. So what do I mean by community empowerment? During my summer visits, I have been enthused by a range of local projects, including the Shetland Community Bike Project, St Abbs Community Centre, Campbelltown Regeneration and the Food Train in Dumfries and Galloway. Just some examples of community-led activity on the ground. Community empowerment is a community owners idea, increasing the population, improving housing, creating jobs and business. It's the people of Govanhill bringing their swimming pool property back to life, creating an arts and health centre and a range of social enterprises, and I look forward to visiting them shortly. It's the work of community-based housing associations, the charities, community councils, the collectives, the uniformed organisations and many others who make our communities so vibrant. It's the hundreds of development trusts realising the potential of local facilities, ambitious community renewable energy projects and daily actions of volunteers who give of their time to support their community. Every day, right across the country, thousands of volunteers are working to create better futures for their families, friends and neighbours. In Scotland, we cherish community with the belief we can take our own decisions and do things for ourselves. But sometimes, as we know, unnecessary barriers get in the way. It is this working together to deliver what local people themselves know will make a difference that is community empowerment. Our approach has economic activity, tackling social injustice and empowering communities at its very heart. And why should the Scottish Parliament be debating community empowerment now? Colleagues in the Chamber are only too aware of the significant challenges and pressures that still face too many of our communities and our people. And these pressures will not be eased in the face of continuing Westminster cuts. Whether it's problems associated with inequality, drugs and alcohol, ill health, chaotic lifestyles, rural isolation or crime, we know that the evidence tells us that we can't solve these problems without local people playing an active role in delivering the solutions. We can't keep just doing things to people, we must do things with people and trust them to do things for themselves. The Commission on the Future Delivery of Public Services in Scotland, led by the late Campbell Christie, made this point repeatedly and strongly. The Government and COSLA's responses to Christie agreed this was a crucial element in the reform of public services and the review of community planning and a vital ingredient in the preventative spend agenda. Community empowerment is not about dumping liabilities or unfair responsibilities on communities while the public sector walks away. On the contrary, it is about providing the tools to do the job and addressing what are seen as blockages to progress. That's why I'm delighted that we're working in partnership with COSLA to develop the bill. We will work alongside our partners in the public, private and third sector to make sure we are doing our utmost to support and encourage community empowerment. This morning we held the first meeting of our cross-sector reference group, and I look forward to continue working with that group as ideas for the proposed legislation move ahead and the bill evolves. Why are we as a government considering this legislation on community empowerment and renewal now? Well, there is a lot going on that we can celebrate. Fantastic examples of community-led action and the public sector supporting that action. But I believe we can do so much more. The ideas contained in our consultation are aimed at removing barriers, upping our collective game, providing greater consistency of standards, and cementing good practice in a legislative framework. Not every action will require legislation, and of course resources must follow the aspiration. Our consultation has the potential to deliver the biggest transfer of power to communities since the creation of this Parliament itself. I would draw attention to some specific ideas that are being progressed. An urban community right to buy, a right for communities to request to take over unused or underused public sector assets, a right to challenge the quality of service delivery, local people having more of a say in how local budgets are spent, strengthen compulsory purchase powers, an overarching duty for the public sector to engage, and making community planning work a duty on all public sector partners. We are also exploring the issues around supporting common good funds, support for allotments, tenant-managed housing and participatory budgeting. Whether or not these ideas are taken forward will be informed by the response to the consultation and on whether they are practical. Legislation must be effective and meaningful. We must be able to realise ambition in practice. But it is right we ask these questions now to give everyone a chance to have their say and have their voice heard in the debate. We are at the start of a process. Not all the ideas we're asking may go forward, and there will be other great ideas that we have not thought of, and that's why the listening process continues. But we know there is much work to be done with this exploratory consultation period closing on the 26th of September. We have built into the timetable the opportunity to consult on a draft bill next year. This will mean that we get the technicalities right and proceed with workable legislation that is fit for purpose in the years to come. I look forward, therefore, to working with people from across the country and the Local Government and Regeneration Committee and the whole Parliament to establish how best we can do that. I should also reflect that our proposed legislation is not this government's only commitment to supporting community empowerment. Colleagues from across government have invested in a range of other measures. For example, since May 2007, over 800 grants for community renewables worth some £16 million have been allocated under CARES and its predecessor scheme. We've also set a target of 500 megawatts of community and locally owned renewables by 2020, which could be worth up to two, of course.
Neil Findlay.
Can you advise how much during that same timescale has gone to large multinationals?
Minister.
I'm not quite clear of the relevance of that particular intervention to the debate we're having right now, and I'll return to the potential that in community-owned renewable sector, over 2.4 billion pounds could be raised and generated for community projects led by local communities and rural businesses over the project's lifetime. That seems like a sizable contribution to change in this country. This will ensure that local people can use their skill and determination to benefit from this crucial plank of our future economic growth by investing in their own futures. We have delivered the new Scottish Land Fund of £6 million over the next 3 years so that many more communities can reap the rewards of land ownership, following in the footsteps of pioneers like the people of Egg and Assynt. And as we're investing around £6 million per year in community anchor organisations like housing associations and development trusts through our People and Communities Fund, enabling them to increase their role in supporting employability and early intervention projects. For this government, community empowerment is not a peripheral issue. It sits alongside our core belief that the people of Scotland are best placed to take decisions about their own futures. Empowered communities are central to shaping a modern Scotland and reforming public services. Along the principles of the Campbell-Christie Commission, prevention, integration, workforce development and improved performance, they will play an increasingly important role in a confident, prosperous and democratically vibrant nation. We believe that Scotland's greatest asset is our people. Our communities are a rich source of creativity and talent, and the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill will be a major opportunity to help realise our potential as a nation. I ask the Parliament to join with us in developing this crucial work to strengthen and grow empowered communities across the country and to support the motion welcoming the consultation on the proposed bill.
Thank you very much. I now call on Sarah Boy to move Amendment 4061.2 and to speak, and you have 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I very much welcome the opportunity this afternoon to debate the progress of the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewable Bill. Freudian slip there. For Scottish Labour, this is very much unfinished business. Our flagship right to buy legislation in the first Parliament gave communities in rural areas the capacity to utilise land in the benefit of those rural areas, with people being attracted to move to those areas and to create economic prosperity, and crucially to enable some of our most remote rural communities to maximise the opportunities that came from the people and came from the land. But we believe that it's crucial that we learn the lessons of those community successes. Community development and finance were absolutely critical, and if I can pick up on the Minister's points about GIA, it is absolutely inspirational. And what they have been able to do as a community in terms of regeneration, attracting people to the island, developing renewables, to the point where they are pretty much self-sufficient, and the fantastic use they've made of renewable energy and different types of renewable energy. They've also made the opportunity of tourism developments on the island. But that needed big money to make it work. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Jamie McGregor.
I thank the member for taking intervention. Does she have any idea how much of HIE's budget goes into revenue funding, publicly funded buyouts?
Sarah Boyd.
No, I think you'd have to ask the Minister that question. The point I'm making is that finance, wherever it comes from, whether it's HIE, whether it's from the big lottery fund, whether it's from the Scottish Government itself, that investment is absolutely crucial to unlock the door so that communities can make the best of those developments. But community management that is effective and cooperative models and different types of ownership models are crucial for the long-term success in urban communities too. And that's not acknowledged in the Scottish Government's consultation paper. So my purpose in moving our amendment today was that we ask parties across the chamber to give it the political priority that's needed to make the legislation effective and add to the menu of options that the Minister's consultation document has. So I very much welcome his initial support for our amendment this afternoon. I'll try not to put him off that support by decision time. I do have some sympathy for the critique in the Conservative amendment, as many people have commented to me that this bill could be seen as a deliberate counterbalance to the SNP's growing reputation for being a centralising government, whether it's police and fire services or colleges, or the SNP's criticism of local government when it doesn't do their bidding. The SNP's track record on subsidiarity isn't perfect, and we have never seen the Scottish Parliament as being the place where power should rest. We are very much committed to devolving to local authorities, but then also devolving from local authorities as well. And that's the challenge of this bill, because it shouldn't just be seen as a challenge for local authorities. I do believe it's also a challenge for our NHS, for Scottish Water, and for the Scottish Government itself. And I hope the Minister will be prepared to have some of the tough arguments with his Cabinet and ministerial colleagues to identify opportunities which simply won't be realised without political will. So we very much welcome the discussion on this bill, and we have a raft of ideas which we will want to see reflected and incorporated in the final legislation. I want to use my speech today to particularly get in two issues where I'd want to highlight issues where we'd want a different flavour coming through in the consultation. Firstly, we'd like a shift in the principles underpinning the bill. The way the introduction reads, it implies that the purpose of this bill is to achieve sustainable economic growth. Now, that's not an objective that we would disagree with necessarily, but we think it's absolutely crucial that we need to make sure that inequalities across communities are addressed in this bill. The SCVO makes some very powerful points on this point. And it's important philosophically because without it, there's nothing to guide the difficult decisions that need to be taken. And the bill could actually inadvertently lead to the widening of inequalities by favouring those who already have the capacity to take action to be successful. So we want that to help underpin the bill. And it goes to the heart of how we identify communities. That could be communities of interest, or it could be geographical communities. And that's why we will argue for the principles of social justice and equality to underpin the ambition behind this bill. Because many public services exist not because of market failure, but because we believe as a society that provision of services and the exercise of rights can be delivered and shaped in a more cost-effective and comprehensive way through collective action. So we think that public services are important, and in devolving from local authorities, in freeing up local resources, whether it's land or buildings, that test will need to take place at the local level as well. And that's why the other omission from this consultation exercise, which I think is unfortunate, is a reference to the role of councillors, a debate about the role of councillors. Now, the COSLA paper talks about that, but I think in the government's own consultation, it would have been better to reflect the fact that local councillors reflect the aspirations of local communities, and they're often the key players, they're often the key champions in local communities to support them, to generate support for initiatives, to make the better use of resources, whether it's asking outside bodies to bring in resource or whether it's about difficult decisions within councils to unlock resources. And I think their role needs to be properly acknowledged because they have a legitimacy which comes from the democratic, the electoral process. They have to weigh up individual community ambitions against wider collective ambitions. And that is a tension that should run through this document and needs to be explored, I think, further. One of the key areas that flows from the discussion is that, and it's a lesson that needs to be learned from the rural ambitions and the right to buy agenda, is that disadvantaged areas do not automatically have the range of expertise that's needed in developing community assets. So capacity building and skills development is key. And it's a point made very effectively by Planning Aid for Scotland. And it leads to a point I would like to make about the linkages and the crossovers between the existing land reform legislation and this bill. And I think it's something that ministers need to reflect on as you go through the consultation process. I would like to see a clarification on what the role of the Land Reform Review Group is and how the Minister sees that as feeding into this consultation, because there needs to be a join-up between rural land reform and right to buy and urban land reform and right to buy. And we saw it with the initial land reform legislation, which is why I think we saw it as unfinished business, because there are communities that are sometimes referred to as rural and are sometimes seen as urban, and we just need to make sure that there's a seamless join-up in terms of the ground rule. So I want to emphasise that point. And it's potentially an incredibly radical element of the bill. One of the areas I'd also like to see fleshed out is the issue of access to privately owned land. Now, that was a key issue in the access to rural right to buy. It's not really fleshed out in this consultation. And again, I think the Minister's giving himself more time. I would like to see what the Minister thinks the ground rules should be, because it's potentially an incredibly radical element of the bill in the context of urban communities. But you don't get any sense from the consultation of what the Scottish Government's intention is in relation to this bill. Now, both the Carnegie Trust and the Scottish Sports Association suggest a register of assets as a key tool to get things moving. So I'd like to see clarification and debate as to whether that should just be for the public sector or whether it should include the private sector as well. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
I think these are very helpful contributions, and it's right that the opposition should ask questions as to what our intent is. But I would restate this exploratory consultation is to capture ideas and suggestions so that we can take it forward. So asking for concrete answers on some of the proposals at this stage is not necessarily relevant, because we're continuing to gather what people aspire to and how it would work in practice.
Sarah Byatt.
I take that point, Minister, but I do think there's a point about leadership. and it's a point about how you utilise the role of government and what your aspirations are for this legislation. That's why linking social justice in with economic aspirations, that's why understanding the reality of disadvantaged communities who need the extra support, and that's where we see the cooperative movement as a key way to lock in success and lock in economic development and social progress at a local level. I finally want to comment about the community empowerment elements of the bill. There has been some tremendous best practice developed over the last decade, but without community capacity building, it will be difficult for the potential of community renewal and regeneration to be achieved in practice. As COSLA note, issues like poverty, poor education, poor health and poor transport can act as barriers to bringing about empowerment that can bring real change. And that's why we see the social justice aspirations as being fundamental to be built in to the philosophical aspirations of this bill. So that's why I do think the vision behind this bill is important, and that does need to direct us. I accept that consultation will help flesh out the detail of the proposals, but you also need a driving ambition behind the bill, and I think that's what we had in the first Parliament in terms of land reform. The opportunities are fantastic. Community cafes, renewables cooperatives, new allotments and gardens, new businesses harnessing derelict and empty buildings. There are many, many examples across the country where rural communities have seen superb progress. We now need to match that in our urban communities. The potential is transformative and radical, but only if we all seize the day. I move the amendment in my name and look forward to today's debate.
Thanks very much. Now call on Margaret Mitchell to speak to and move Amendment 4061.1. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. The Community Empowerment and Renewable Bill consultation states that the bill seeks to strengthen opportunities for communities to take independent action to achieve their own goals and aspirations, and to ensure communities are able to have a greater role in determining how their local public services are delivered. This is certainly an aspiration which everyone in the Chamber will support, so I'll begin by highlighting some of the provisions which are most certainly worthy of support and which I hope can be progressed. In the first instance, I very much welcome views being sought on how common good assets are currently managed and whether communities should be involved in this process. These assets are left to communities for their use, yet there are countless occasions when local people have been angered and dismayed when local authorities, at taxpayers' expense, undertake legal action to use the assets for a purpose other than that for which they were intended. The consultation also asks what changes should be made to better support communities taking forward Grow Your Own projects. Recent research demonstrates the clear demand for allotment plots across Scotland, and when land is made available, it can be put to good use, not only as allotments, but also as a community garden. The community garden in Bothwell became a reality as a result of a concentrated and concerted effort from local people to have a place where individuals, local pupils and organisations can meet and where vegetables and fruit and plants is grown. Subsequently, numerous positive physical, mental and educational outcomes have been achieved for the community. This kind of initiative evolves from a consensus and drive from within the community, and as such, it has the greatest chance of succeeding and enduring. Consequently, it's this type of empowerment to be encouraged and supported, a view highlighted by the Scottish Sports Association in its comments about the important role volunteers play in empowering communities. The publication of public asset registers is hugely important in progressing this kind of empowering of communities, as this information is absolutely critical for communities to take a community garden type project forward. However, to put the whole community empowering debate in perspective, it must be recognised that the empowering legislation in itself does not necessarily achieve the desired objective. This was a point emphasised by SCVO in their initial response to the consultation. The question is therefore, in encouraging urban empty and unused or underused property back into use, has the Minister considered the lessons to be learned from the community right to buy legislation already in existence? According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, whilst beneficial, the take-up of the powers in this legislation has been relatively small. The major deterring factors include the complexity of the process, the resource-intensive administrative requirements, and the lack of available funding. The clear message here is that without the funding to accompany empowering legislation, it's not going to be effective. And this is perhaps one of the tools to which the Minister referred was necessary to do the job. Turning now to the Conservative amendment, this highlights where the government rhetoric has not met the reality and the number of occasions where local communities totally opposed to projects or initiatives such as wind farms, incinerators or the siting of mobile phone masts have had these views ignored by central government. This despite the fact more often than not the local authority has refused planning permission only to have the decision overturned centrally by the Scottish Government. In my region alone... Yes, certainly.
Mike Mackenzie.
You'll be aware that many people lament the lack of mobile phone coverage across Scotland. If we're not able to put masts in the right places to give that coverage, how on earth would we manage to achieve that? And which would you prefer, mobile phone coverage or no masts? Because you can't have both.
Margaret Mitchell.
The member makes a reasonable point, but given the choices available for the siting of mobile phones, to site it next to a school playground, for example, doesn't seem to me like a sensible decision. And yet these are the decisions currently being taken. So I think we need to get some perspective and balance into this debate. In my region alone, there are numerous examples from Shorts, Harthill and Green Gears, to name but a few. This is the antithesis of what empowering legislation seeks to achieve, and I hope the consultation will reflect this concern and lead to a change of heart by the Minister and his government. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I have major reservations about some of the provisions within the consultation relating to whether communities should have a right to request a local authority to use compulsory purchase order on their behalf to bring vacant and unused property back into use, and whether councils should have additional powers to sell or lease long-term empty homes and non-domestic property where it is in the public interest to do so. The right to own property is a fundamental one in any free, civilised and democratic society. Consequently, the definition of the public interest would have to be very precisely defined. There is much to applaud within this consultation, and I look forward to reading the responses when it actually does close. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. We now turn to the open debate, speeches of 6 minutes. I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased indeed to have been called to speak in this afternoon's debate. As we have heard, this is indeed an important and very wide-ranging consultation on how I believe we can all collectively, working together, transform our communities and empower them to meet the challenges that they face at a local level. And I would therefore echo the Minister's comments to encourage both individual citizens and groups across Scotland to respond to the consultation. There's still time, and this will ensure that their views and ideas are heard and can be taken into account. And of course, that in turn will ensure that we have the best possible legislative footing for what the Minister has rightly suggested could be a very significant power transfer to local communities. The consultation, as we have heard, focuses on 3 key areas, and the first looks at how we strengthen community participation. And there are many ideas on the table here, and I expect we'll hear many more as a result of the consultation, but I would like to say a few words about the role of community councils, because I don't think that has been addressed yet this afternoon. And in my experience as both a Westminster MP and now happily as a member of this Parliament, I would say that those individuals elected onto community councils are hard-working representatives of their local communities, and they are dedicated to making a difference. They know their communities well, they understand their communities, and they do bring with them different areas of expertise. And whilst community councils are the only type of community group with a formal statutory role in the planning system, in many other areas of local life, I believe that they see themselves as being perhaps eclipsed from time to certain extents by other forms of community engagement that we have seen develop over recent years. I'll certainly give way.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving way. Let's cut to the chase. Does she think community councils should have bigger budgets?
Annabel Ewing.
I think community councils should have greater resources in general, including more extensive powers to do the job that I think they all wish to seek to do. And what I would say also is that I believe that there's a role for all those individuals in communities who are determined to make a difference. And I don't believe that there should be a competition between different structures of community engagement, for that would be counterproductive. And I think that the challenge for the Minister, therefore, should he, to coin a phrase, choose to accept it, is to find a way forward whereby community councils can be helped to maximise their positive role, whilst at the same time other forms of community participation can be encouraged and facilitated. I'm afraid I'll have to make some progress at this point. Presumably, the ultimate aim must be to secure engagement amongst all those who wish to be involved in order to ensure that we maximise the potential of each local community. Another very important part of the consultation looks at unlocking enterprising community development. And I have to say that this is a subject very close to my heart, since I did some contract work for some years a while back for the Comrie Development Trust, a very successful development trust which operates in the village that I'm very pleased to call my home. And if, presiding officer, an example of best practice was ever needed as to how to seek to unlock community potential, I submit that Comrie, through not only the Development Trust but also the Community Council and the some 50 different groups and bodies involved in the local community, would be at the very top of the tree in terms of best practice. And underlying all those groups are determined and visionary and indefatigable individuals who have ideas and who wish to see their ideas come to fruition. And they have made an enormous difference in a village of what is fewer than 2,000 people. And I would mention two particular examples in the very limited time available this afternoon. And the first is the establishment within 1 year of the idea being mooted, the Comrie Junior Strings. This was a group of people who decided that they were not seeing children getting access to tuition in stringed instruments. They went out, they raised money, they got donated violins and cellos from people's attics and whatnot, and they got together, and now we see, with the lead of the indefatigable Jean Kidd, who is well known in music circles across Scotland, 9 children, primary school age in Comrie, learning the violin and the cello. I think that is an amazing example of what can be done locally if you have the individual determination and can-do spirit. The other example I would pick, again, within 1 year of the idea being mooted amongst running enthusiasts in Comrie, I'm afraid I'm not one of those, which might be evident from my physique, but we saw the idea of a Comrie mountain marathon, and this is a 2-day event that had its launch last October, and it attracted thousands of participants to come to Comrie to stay overnight and to enjoy the hospitality. Again, this was an idea. People were not satisfied with simply having the idea. They wanted to ensure that it came to fruition. So we need to find a way to take best practice, to bottle this can-do spirit that I believe is present in communities across the length and breadth of Scotland. It is also about, as Sarah Boyd said, increasing capacity, because we are very fortunate in the village that I call home to have a number of people who have had experience of different things that have helped these kind of processes. Finally, presiding officer, on the issue of community buyout, I'm very pleased indeed to see that the Land Reform Review Group has been set up and is to be tasked with looking at improving the process. I support the extension of community buyout to urban areas. This has been such a landmark success of this Scottish Parliament, and of course the first buyout we saw was in Crossgates in Fife. I think this consultation is an excellent example of a government that is determined to make a difference in the lives of our citizens, that is listening to people, and with a final plea, empty and dangerous buildings. We absolutely must do something about that. That depresses communities throughout Scotland, and I'm sure that the Minister will be determined to ensure that local authorities have the necessary powers to tackle that problem. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Call Claire Baker to be followed by Sandra White.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in today's debate on community empowerment and renewal. This is an early debate on which is a wide range of proposals, and while the document certainly identifies the problems, there are still lots of question marks over what the solutions might be. We should emphasise the importance of the purpose of the proposals, and we need to be sensible and proportionate about where and when legislation is needed. While some of the discussion is about the transfer of assets, there is also a recognition that local authorities need to be given additional powers to deal with many of the challenges in their area. Lawrence DeMarco of Senscott has commented that proposals have the potential to be either a damp squib or a significant advance in local democracy. And it is clear that increasing democracy is not just about empowering communities, but will be about devolving more powers to local authorities when that is appropriate. We are in difficult economic times, and local government will need to manage very difficult budgets over the next few years with increasing pressure on their services. We should be mindful of this context. We're not saying to people, come along and help us spend the money, but we're asking them to take part in some very difficult decisions. This can provide opportunities for doing things differently. The Minister referred to the Christie Commission, and the consultation's comments on strengthening participation does open up options for debate. But we should also ask how these proposals will address inequality within our communities and how they will include those communities which are often the hardest to reach. Access to the benefits of these proposals should be widely available. The SCVO briefing comments that, without measures to ensure that all communities have the opportunity to engage with and benefit from the bill, there is a risk that it will widen inequalities by favouring those communities who already have the capacity to take action. And proposals really must be tested against this measure. And as Sarah Boyack said, sustainable economic growth is not enough. This must also be about increasing social justice. There is an appetite for the issues identified in the consultation. As Shadow Spokesperson for Rural Affairs, I'm only too aware of the importance of ensuring there's a healthy and strong relationship between people in their community and their land. The consultation document identifies that interest there is in extending the benefits which have been brought to rural communities through the land reform legislation to urban communities. Scotland already has many positive examples of community buyouts, such as the Galston Estate in Lewis, which has been run by residents since 2007, Stornoway Trust, Gia and Machrihanish. Indeed, some 500,000 acres of land in Scotland is now in community ownership. The bold measures that were taken during the early years of the Parliament, along with the commitment of local communities, has helped to transform rural and island communities in Scotland. So it's important that we take the opportunity to see if these successes can be given the chance to be replicated in more urban environments, not just the more familiar model of tenant ownership, but further into community ownership, looking at, for example, the benefits of alternative energy models and how we could use this to tackle the fuel poverty issues that are in many communities. But to make the discussion only about transferring public assets or public services is to miss the complexity of the issue and limit the benefits it can deliver. Local government is a key partner in future models, and while transfer of ownership can be the catalyst for change, empowerment can also be achieved through increasing community decision-making, and it's important to achieve the right solution for an individual community at a particular point in time. In addition to owning an asset, communities can become empowered through having much greater influence and involvement in service delivery. I visited Ravenscraig Community Gardens and allotments in Kirkcaldy on Sunday as part of the Open Doors Day. And opened in February this year, they have turned around a disused space which is owned by Fife Council.
Jamie McGregor.
You mentioned some of the buyouts, well, I agree with you that these are marvellous. Can you please tell me what you would do to produce revenue funding to follow up the actual buyouts?
Claire Baker.
I think it's an important issue, and the document has to look at the resources, but when we look at the way in which an island like Gia has become actually very self-sustainable, there's opportunities for revenue raising within the new models of community ownership. But I've returned to my experience on Sunday at Kirkcaldy allotments, and it's quite a mouthful, but Kirkcaldy Community Gardens and Allotments Community Interest Company was created in order to set up a 25-year lease of the site within the Ravenscraig walled gardens for allotment provision. And they bring much more than just individual allotments. They have a training area for local schools and community groups as well. And talking to members at the weekend, they did feel that there could be a streamlining of the process, but that the local authority did continue to be a positive partner in their work. A recent report from the Scottish Agricultural College's Rural Policy Centre highlighted the dangers and risks faced by many towns and communities. Their vulnerability index placed Kirkcaldy, Alloa and East Weems, all within my region, in their top 20. And while what these towns and across Scotland need is the opportunity not just to survive, but to thrive. And there's an interesting contrast between East Weems and West Weems. East Weems is 13th on the list of vulnerable towns in Scotland. However, its neighbour, West Weems, has seen a bit of a turnaround. The West Weems Walk-In is owned and operated by the community. Driven by West Weems Development Trust, lottery money was awarded to support the initiative, and the social enterprise has now been open for a year. And due to that investment, they provide a lot to the community. It's not just a bistro, it's also children's clubs and baking clubs. And this has meant this is a community that only 10 years ago had only 60 people in that community. And they are seeing a huge turnaround from this kind of involvement and this kind of public community ownership. So there is agreement on what the challenges are, but this is a ship that needs to be steered, and the direction of travel needs to be clearly defined as one that is about delivering on social justice and tackling inequality in communities across Scotland.
Many thanks. Now call Sandra White to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This proposed bill is one I've been following with a lot of interest since the idea was first put forward in the SNP's manifesto, and it's one that I very much support. And the Minister and the previous Minister will know that I think I was never out of the office to push this particular bill on. I think it's something that's very, very important. And I can appreciate that it's taken a while to get where it is today. But we are here now, and I think it's a great opportunity to give local people a real say in their communities. Now, Margaret Mitchell mentioned in her contribution some, what she said, good things in the proposed bill regarding common good funds. Absolutely agree with you. I think it has to be looked at. And community gardens, and absolutely agree with you on that particular one. However, I would like to briefly note the amendment in the name of yourself, Margaret. And if I read it rightly, when you take out what's to be taken out, it's we're not to look positively on the partnership with COSLA, local authorities or the wider public, and we're not to congratulate the huge amount of people across the country who dedicate their time and energy to making a positive difference in their communities. That seems to be what the amendment says to me. And instead, carrying on to your amendment, instead we're to talk about demoralising people and stifling community empowerment. Well, maybe I'll leave it up to the Conservatives, the Tories, to talk about that. After all, as has just been said by my colleague Bob Doris, the Tories are the experts in demoralising people and stifling communities. And very sorry to see that type of amendment, Margaret, being put forward. Oh, sorry, yes, yeah.
Margaret Mitchell.
I think it's important if we're having this debate that we look at the situation as it is. And it seemed to be, rather than patting ourselves on the back and say we're talking to all these different parties, the reality is very often the wishes of local communities are being overturned and their views ignored. And that's what the amendment seeks to highlight and hopefully lead to a change in direction and thinking in the government's part.
Sandra White.
I do accept your explanation. It's pity that wasn't part of the amendment. It certainly didn't read that way to me. I think this bill is all about what you're saying and giving people more powers to actually say that we want to be involved in the communities. And we're talking about local government. People have raised that before. And, the concordance between central and local government, yes, it has its detractors, and we've heard a few perhaps words on that tonight, but its real aim is to devolve more power and decision-making to local authorities to decide about what their priorities are. Now, surely that's a good thing, basically, going forward. And whilst we may talk about that in another sphere, it must be a good thing to be able to work together to give real power to local communities. And I think that's something that should actually be very, very looked at. Now, I spoke about the Conservative amendment, and now I want to turn to perhaps the Labour Party's amendment. And to me, it seems entirely reasonable. In particular, the right to buy, and Sarah Boyatt has mentioned this, is one of the Scottish Parliament's landmark achievements. And I do hope, like Sarah Boyatt and others have raised issues, that the experience that rural communities have will generally inform the process to go forward in the urban areas. I mean, in Glasgow, for instance, in my own constituency and others, we've often looked on enviously at communities in rural areas they've been able to take forward a real vision for what they'd like to see a local asset and provide this to the community and be able to take over public assets as well. It would be fantastic if we could bring this forward to inner cities. And one example, which I think most people have cited in their own areas as well, one of the examples I'd love to see happen is that when I'm walking about in the constituency, and people probably know where I am, it's the bottom of Byres Road. There's a fantastic building there that used to be the old Church Street baths at the bottom of Byres Road. People have asked me on numerous occasions, can we turn it back into the old baths? I don't know. It's a great building. Can we turn it into a market? I don't know. We've written, if we could get some commitment to turn that into something that the people would dedicate themselves to, I think that would be absolutely fantastic. And if this bill can give us the necessary tools to do that, it would be absolutely fantastic also. Now, since I've been working on or looking at this bill, since the consultation, I've sent out loads and loads of contacts to my contacts to ask them to consult in this bill, and I know they certainly have got back. People are very excited and energised about what this bill can actually do for them, and I think if local communities get the opportunity, they will certainly absolutely use it. And we have community planning partnerships and the community councils and all local groups who are working together, but sometimes they feel as though they're being hindered by current legislation and a lack of ability to really devolve the decision-making to local level. And I would ask the Minister and encourage the Government to work very closely with these groups, local authorities and others, to facilitate devolving more power to local communities and learning from the actions that we've already achieved to do this. And I think one good example of good practice, again, is the Glasgow Woodlands Community Development Trust. It was set up in 1985 by local residents, the support of Glasgow City Council, and then further on from them, the support of the Scottish Parliament. That's went from strength to strength. They involved local nurseries, they involved local schools. It's an absolutely fantastic community asset. Climate Change Fund has been put forward, Zero Waste Scotland, and also the City Council as well. And there's also another one which, believe it or not, it's called Sage Project, and it's actually the city centre. It's not far from where I live, and I actually have an allotment there, although I must admit I must get my green fingers out and do some work there. But this is in the middle of the city centre, and this is a project that's been put forward by government funding and government help. So it's that type of thing we want to look at, because it's really, really very important to give local communities a say in their communities and give them the provisions within this bill to enable them to carry that forward. And I really look forward to the further consultation, the ideas that come in, and hopefully perhaps another debate and scrutinising what we've came forward from the consultation, Minister. I think it's really good, and I'd really congratulate the Minister himself for pushing this forward. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Before I call Malcolm Chisholm, can I just remind members to speak through the chair and address each other by full names, please. Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Presiding Officer, engagement and empowerment are ideas we've been talking about for many years in this Parliament in different contexts, and they've led to important documents such as the current government's Scottish Community Empowerment Action Plan and a previous government's National Standards for Community Engagement, which I seem to remember launching in 2005. Notwithstanding the good examples given by the Minister, however, I think it's fair to say that policy and practice over the years have often diverged, and I think the important thing in this debate is to make sure that we come up with practical ways of driving forward this agenda. Now, I think, to be fair, the consultation paper is full of many such suggestions, and if I can deal with the three parts in reverse order. First, part 3, briefly, I welcome the additional powers that are suggested to sell or lease long-term empty property, and of course that picks up on a theme that we were debating in the Parliament last week. I also like the idea of communities having the right to request local authorities to use compulsory purchase orders, although clearly we have to look at strengthening those as well. And I welcome question 38 on the recovery of costs in relation to dangerous and defective buildings, although I would gently suggest that the Minister should look at Dave Stewart's bill for an answer to that question. Moving on to section 2, we have the fundamental concept, of course, of the transfer of assets. And as an city MSP, I'd be delighted, of course, if the right to buy that rural communities have had is extended to urban areas. I think we all know of the success of that policy in rural parts of Scotland, and a communication this week Maggie Fife of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust said, I haven't got time to read it all out, Egg is a different world than it was 15 years ago. Owning Egg has opened up so many opportunities for development. Because of the confidence that has grown, a lot of new independent businesses are springing up, and because there's so much happening, we're seeing young people return and settle here, which is probably one of the most important aspects. I also like the idea in Section 2 of the communities having a power to request the public sector transfer underused or unused assets, but we must confront in this regard the issue of state aid rules, because state aid rules are often a barrier to this, and I had an example in my own community about 2 years ago where a community group wanted the transfer of land at Granton and the council invoked state aid rules as a barrier to that. Now, my understanding is that these rules only apply where there's a commercial competitor, so I think that probably does mean there isn't an issue in many of these situations. But I suspect the state aid rules are being overused by some public authorities. So I hope the government will look at that. And I wonder, in fact, whether, given that there are general block exemption regulations at a European level, whether the government could take action asking for a GBER notification for all community assets. I don't know whether that's possible, but perhaps it could be explored. Now, Part 1 about strengthening community participation is, of course, central to the whole paper. I obviously welcome the idea of a duty to follow the national standards for community engagement. I also think, and this isn't mentioned in the paper, that we should look very much at using and developing the co-op model that Sarah Boyack mentioned, and I'm glad the Scottish Government has accepted that amendment. I suggest that the Government does look at what's going on currently in Edinburgh at present. Of course, that's a coalition between Labour and SNP, although it's fair to say that it was a flagship policy of the Labour manifesto earlier this year. I also think we should build on the work of community councils. I certainly regularly attend these and have a high regard for their work, but I think building on their work is the right way to put it. I also want to highlight, in relation to strengthening participation, that effective participation starts with effective communication, and I think this should be central to policies in this area as well. There are examples of best practice that we can learn from where community activists are using the tools that they have to hand to improve communication in the hope that this will strengthen local interest and participation. As we begin to adapt communication technologies to aid participation, a large number of independent sites allowing highly localised content have started to emerge. For example, the Edinburgh Reporter provides regular updates through a hyper-local news site focusing on the activities of community councils and news stories of particular appeal to local residents. If participation can be improved through developing greater links to an open and accountable council system, then straightforward reporting of council and community council meetings can help to achieve that. Some of the Edinburgh Reporter's most popular stories have come from a comprehensive coverage of campaigns, as well as an unbiased account of what is really going on in the City Council. This news can be delivered immediately using Twitter and live blogs, and can invite responses from any interested party. Now, I'm not saying this in order to give the Edinburgh Reporter free publicity. I believe that the success of this local online news service should be an example for the whole of Scotland, and I'm appealing to the government to do everything it can to support and encourage the development of such services. I should also, of course, mention in this context Greener Leith, which provides a similar local news service, and the Greener Leith Social, which is an interactive forum for raising awareness of local concerns. If such a format can be applied to hyper-local news, then why not to community councils or local social events as well? I can see I'm running out of time before I talk about my suggestion of an online hub that could be established to allow a two-way flow of information between community councils, community planning partnerships and community members. I can't say more about that, but I do believe new technologies can help to change the culture of doing to a culture of doing with, and at the end of the day, that is what this debate is all about.
Many thanks. I have a little bit of time in hand, not much at this stage of the debate, for interventions. I call Chick Brodie to be followed by Alison McInnes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate on the consultation, and it is a debate on the consultation re the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. If I do so with a hint of frustration, it is that I believe we need to move quickly beyond the consultative phase on community powers and pursue action and change to inspire revive and renew our communities, and to do so quickly. In the bill, of course, there are proposals. There is already a well of information what needs or might need to be done in favour of communities and community powers. But I believe structure is also important, and that needs to be looked at too. We've had 10 years of community planning and community planning partnerships. Frankly, I was appalled to look recently at the minutes of one CPP meeting where 22 people from all the support services attended. No doubt each a worthy contributor, but I would suggest that particular size of meeting is not conducive to fast response to community needs and action. One has to ask how you can achieve attainment of a single outcome, indeed achievement of many outcomes with such a large representative body, well-meaning and community-spirited, though each member of that body may be. I suggest to the Government that real determination of community needs has to be complemented by a wider consultation, a consultation that ensures and secures meaningful representation by communities on the ground, people on the ground. I do not denigrate the suggestions which may be proposed in the bill, but want to know what the communities want. What do the people want? For example, the role of local authorities is to serve not just one community, but to serve many and varied communities in their area regarding their different needs and wants. If we mean that local authorities facilitate and maintain community planning, including consulting and cooperating with communities, then I suggest we confuse the local authority management regime with that of the much-needed management of the smaller defined communities within that local area, communities to which we should be devolving meaningful management, leadership and funding. It is suggested that real outcomes will only be achieved when we establish quite clear delineation of responsibilities and anticipated outcomes between central government, local authorities and communities. Now, I accept that CPPs have been a qualified, a reasonable success, but there has been a confusion in that they are not standard, nor should they be in their methodology of engaging the range of public bodies and representations of the third and private sectors. That adds to the confusion, as I said, as to how we measure outcomes and the effectivity of each CPP. And communities across the length and breadth of Scotland are different. That's why the local communities must be major players and fully consulted on the bill and its powers. I think it was Churchill that said in 1951 that we should set the people free. I believe that's what the bill should be, about setting communities free, about devolving leadership and responsibility to each and every community, the right to manage and challenge the local authorities. The structure as it is today is too complex, with too many of the CPP stakeholders having an eye, understandably, to their other accountabilities at a local authority level. I strongly suggest to the Government that they link this bill tangentially and where they can to the procurement bill, so that communities have a greater say, not just in the provision of services to their community, but in buying, in some cases, and indeed managing. The burden on the Government in this purpose, in this bill, will be to encourage, develop and empower, hopefully, community councils. That we then give them prominence in funding, in budget management, in asset management, in the design, procurement and delivery of services and facilities to their individual communities. Of course, there will be areas reserved after the bill is enacted to local authorities, things like housing, education and transport. But engagement of and security of community interest will only be achieved by true, as I said earlier, devolution of management and leadership of the communities to those who live in them and who own them. The current local authority system, I think, is slightly antediluvian, far too wide. The proposed bill gives us a chance to consult on a meaningful local and community service that I believe will meet the aspiration of the peoples in our communities and our aspirations as a nation.
Many thanks. I call Alison McInnes to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, the Liberal Democrats also welcome this consultation on the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. Turning over power to a local level is a fundamental aim of our party, and we look forward to working constructively with the Government once the consultation is over and the bill is introduced. It's difficult to talk about community empowerment without referring to the work of the Christie Commission, and the Minister has already done that. We're fortunate that we do have such a wide-ranging and comprehensive blueprint before us for the future delivery of public services. But the ethos of the Commission's report goes beyond public services. It is at its heart about putting communities first. And when Christie says effective services must be designed with and for people and communities, not delivered top-down, I believe the same holds true across all of government. And wherever possible, we here in Parliament should not be dictating to communities, but rather giving them the tools to tailor their own solutions. And our own Home Rule Commission is to some extent building on Christie's work. We are expanding it far further, of course, looking at our overall vision for a strong Scotland within the UK. But the basis of it is about giving communities the power to set their own agenda, to take back control of the things that are important to them. There are a number of interesting possibilities as to how we might translate the goal of community empowerment into the reality of action in Scotland. Certainly too many to discuss in full today, and so I do encourage as many people as possible to consider what they and their community would like to see eventually become part of this bill. I would particularly commend to the Minister the RSA's Citizen Power project and more generally the work of the Carnegie Trust and indeed Nesta, and urge him to draw on their research. At a local level, there's much good practice in my region in Aberdeenshire in a range of rural partnerships and community trusts that are already in place. One idea, mooted in the consultation and already in place with some degree of success in England and Wales, is the possibility of giving community the power to take over key local assets. That might be in the shape of community centres or parks, or perhaps something more fundamental, such as social housing. I believe we should think of it not as asset transfer, but as asset exchange, something that allows communities to weave together the latent assets of individuals and organisations for the benefit of a whole community. But we must guard against trying to draft good ideas onto problematic structures, so we need to take time to get the framework right. It will take a significant culture change to make public services more human scale. I think Chick Brodie has already referred to that, and to localise economic power as well as political power. Beyond what we occasionally see already with community groups kind of feeling public amenities, we might look to expand further. One option would be to give communities the power to formally come together and take control of a whole raft of services from local authorities. This might, for example, allow them to take control of all the recreational or social care facilities, receiving an appropriate proportion of the council's budget, be it from council tax, business rates or so on, as their funds, and with full control over how the money is spent, along with a legal recognition of their role. The key here, though, is that we have to have flexibility. Rather than us here in Parliament determining what role communities should take, we should be putting a framework in place that will allow them to determine that for themselves. And what works for one community will not necessarily work for all. It's also essential that all communities benefit, not only those currently with the capacity to take action. And Sarah Boyer was right to point to the SCVO's representations on that point. The bill also provides an opportunity for us to look at the way that planning works at a very local level. And Margaret Mitchell has touched on this issue already. One of the main weaknesses of our planning system is the tension that is created between residents and council planning committees, a tension not likely to be resolved simply by passing planning control further down the line. But I would be interested to know what consideration the Minister has given as to how this bill could look at resolving that, whether through a greater role for community organisations in the process, or perhaps a fairer way of ensuring that the financial benefits of new developments are kept within the local community. Finally, society increasingly devalues older people, yet we have an increasingly ageing population, as we never end talking about in this chamber. Many older people, however, feel over-institutionalised and disengaged from society. This bill could be an opportunity for more inclusive and innovative solutions to help improve older people's lives. Those are just a few possibilities. I hope that when the consultation responses are published, we'll see a fuller picture of how people across Scotland think that local decision-making can better work for them. And then the trick will be ensuring that ministers listen to what respondents say is important to them. No doubt that's a big challenge. This will be an important bill. It is a real test of where the government and indeed this Parliament's intentions lie, localism or centralisation. I believe firmly in localism and I want to be able to work constructively on the bill. I can't help but be concerned for its final form because we see a government here who's just pressed ahead with one of the biggest centralisation programmes this Parliament has seen. But I live in hope.
Thank you. I now call Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Presiding Officer, I would like to start first of all by paying a tribute to the many community volunteers across the Highlands and Islands, and indeed across all of Scotland, who work selflessly for the benefit of their communities. And I can personally attest that the work at the coalface of community development is often done in very difficult conditions and in the face of economic fragility and deprivation, and in a culture where power is not always surrendered easily to communities who wish to grasp the opportunities available to them. Nevertheless, since the right to buy was introduced in 2003, and especially when this was combined with the income generation opportunities offered to communities by renewable energy projects, community development has begun to transform the face of the Highlands and Islands. And I could pay tribute to a very long list of communities, but it's only right that I suppose that I should pay particular tribute to my fellow islanders in the communities of Egg and Gia, who paved the way for many other communities. I know that the people of these two communities would agree with me that their path in taking responsibility of community ownership has not always been an easy one, but I know that they would also agree that it's been a worthwhile one. And that's why I'm delighted that the Scottish Government has committed a further £6 million to the Scottish Land Fund, because there's an appetite on the part of many more communities to benefit from local land and local assets and from bringing these into much more productive use. And that's why I'm delighted also that the right to buy legislation is to be revisited and reviewed so that we can apply the lessons, learn the lessons and apply them that we've learned over these last 9 years or so and improve this legislation. It's right, though, that we should take our time with this and with the proposed Community Empowerment Bill, because these are complex matters, sometimes fraught with difficulties and which can be hard to appreciate, except by those actively engaged in community development at the grassroots. And the consultation, Presiding Officer, covers the Community Empowerment Consultation covers a wide number of areas and proposes a number of very interesting ideas, all of which have merit and which I'm sure will, at least in theory, receive support across the chamber. But it's important, and it's critically important, that the practical implementation of these ideas is considered very carefully. All the more so because we owe it to volunteers and community activists across Scotland, those people who give up their very valuable time without recompense. We owe it to these people to get this right and not to present them with more difficulties than they already face. And I'm particularly glad to see consideration of extending the right to buy to urban areas. Too often there's an urban-rural divide. Opportunities that are open to rural communities should also be open to urban communities and also to communities of interest. The underlying theme here seems to be one of bringing assets into more productive use. And should it really matter whether these are in rural or urban areas or how a particular community is defined? And this applies equally to underused public properties. Who owns them should really be neither here nor there, for in reality, they are always public assets belonging to all of us. Presiding Officer, empowerment of communities means disempowerment somewhere else. For power is really neither created or destroyed. Too often in Scotland's past, power has been expressed as the ability to say no to the legitimate aspirations of individuals and of communities. Real power, though, is the power to say yes and to facilitate the aspirations of Scotland's communities. I'm delighted, therefore, that this Scottish Government is taking forward this consultation with a will to share power and to do so wisely, to empower communities and to engage them in their own success by giving them the tools to secure better futures for themselves, but ultimately for all of us.
Many thanks. I now call Anne McTaggart to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to take part in today's debate, of which I think the term is like the graveyard shift kind of springs to mind. Community empowerment and renewal is an issue that goes to the heart of not only my own values, but to the heart of Labour Party values also. And as such, I relish the opportunity to speak about the good work currently being done in this area and the vital work still to be done. I have to say, though, Presiding Officer, I was surprised that we were having this debate so early in the legislative process, and to the extent that the Government has not actually closed the consultation. However, it is good to see that the Minister is so eager to discuss community empowerment and renewal, and I will forgive his haste and welcome his keenness and aspirational approach. Absolutely.
Minister.
To clarify, the reason I requested the debate is so that Parliament could help inform the debate and the work going forward, and that seems like a very democratic thing to do. In addition to that, I'm trying to highlight the consultation so we can encourage all parts of Scotland to contribute to it, so we get it right.
Anne McTaggart.
As a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, I am looking forward to this bill being presented to the committee. I think it will be one where committee members will, much in the way of consensus. However, it will also find scrutiny from the committee when necessary. I will want to see this bill achieve a real support for localism, with power devolved to the most local levels, and for these local levels to be resourced and funded adequately, and to enable this to happen. Presiding Officer, community empowerment and renewal is an issue which has risen in prominence over recent years. In 2003, one of the Labour-led coalition flagship bills was the Local Government Bill, which gave local communities for the first time the right to buy land in the communities they live. This legislation was much welcomed and went a long way in encouraging rural communities to buy into their own land. There is still work needed to ensure that urban areas, such as Glasgow, the area I represent, are given that same opportunity to be enfranchised in their communities and are encouraged to find use for unused and derelict land and buildings. Since the Act was passed, over 120 applications have been made for local people to buy out land in their own areas. We should learn the lessons from rural areas and apply them to urban ones. Presiding Officer, across Scotland there are towns and cities which have been left out of community renewal and are in desperate need of regeneration. Therefore, it is essential that when the Government formulates and considers this legislation, that they make urban areas and areas of deprivation a priority. This Government must resist the urge to centralise and realise that local government is best placed to deliver this initiative. This legislation should be about a localised bottom-up approach to regeneration to allow local communities to grow and flourish. It must put in place a framework which will ensure that local people are able to access their local communities. Localism must be at the heart of legislation, and the Government must find a way to work with local government to make sure this goal is achievable. In my own region of Glasgow, City Council has been putting localism and Labour values into action, the process of which has been led by Councillor Aileen Colleran.
It was only last week that the Council's Stalled Spaces programme won top prize for community involvement at the Scottish Awards for Quality Planning, a community project designed specifically to target temporarily vacant or underutilised land and bring it back into use. And I was happy to table a motion last week in Parliament congratulating them on this achievement. Stalled Spaces is a real achievement for the Council and Glasgow, but most importantly, the local community. However, while it is important to highlight the success projects, Presiding Officer, in the Chamber, the only way community projects flourish if the government are serious in putting stable funding and resourcing in place for them. Certainly.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The member has just said that the only way these projects succeed if the government is willing to put money in and so on. Is it not true that these projects will not succeed unless they correctly identify the right local people in the right place at the right time, with enough confidence in themselves to go ahead?
Anne McTaggart.
I stand to be corrected, Ms MacDonald. And someone had mentioned, it was Claire Baker had mentioned earlier, if these projects are set up in good faith, they can sustain themselves and, yes, wouldn't need that amount of funding thereafter. Presiding Officer, for the legislation to be successful, there must be strong leadership on a local level. Community development courses reinstated rather than cut to allow communities to grow and be trained. Joined up working from local government and Scottish Government, and a real effort to engage communities in regeneration. There are times at present when local communities do not feel part of the decision-making processes that determines what their communities actually look like. The Scottish Government must be explicit to ensure that legislation empowers communities rather than simply pay lip service to them. Otherwise, it will be letting down the communities this legislation purports to represent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now call Mark MacDonald to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome this debate. I think it's very timely, as the Minister indicated, coming before the end of the consultation. It allows us to put views into it and also to promote it to wider Scottish society. I want to take this opportunity to highlight a number of examples from within the North East, which I think demonstrate best practice and give an indication of the kind of projects that could be realised and could be strengthened as a result of this process. The first of those harks back to my maiden speech in this chamber when I highlighted the work of the Udney Community Wind Turbine. It was established as a result of the local community council deciding that they wanted to develop a local wind turbine and use the money that was generated from selling the electricity to the grid to then fund local projects. They estimate that over the 20-year lifespan, over the 20-year period that they had projected, they could raise as much as £4 to £5 million for that small community, which only comprises a couple of villages in the Aberdeenshire area. And I had the pleasure of then visiting the turbine later that year, following it being officially switched on. Once that had happened, one of the next things which happened was that the Udney Community Wind Turbine was awarded the Community Initiative Award at last year's Scottish Green Energy Awards. I think it's a fantastic example of the kind of community renewable initiatives that the Minister was referring to in his opening speech, and I think sets a strong example for what can be achieved by communities coming together, recognising a strong project and then working to deliver it, and something which I think could be strengthened by some of the aspects of the bill which may be brought forward. One of the other things I want to touch on, I want to look at the issue of the leased community centre. In Aberdeen City, where I had the pleasure to serve as a local councillor, a number of community centres were already leased, and there are more which are going to become leased. One which I want to highlight because I've had a deal of experience with it both in previous employment when working for Maureen Watt and also when I was standing for election to another parliament as the candidate for Aberdeen South, is the Inchgarth Community Centre, a leased community centre run by and for the community. And it is popular, vibrant. They've recently added a tea room to the community centre, which is doing a roaring trade. One of their volunteers, a 17-year-old Rory Morrison, was recently awarded the Young Volunteer Award at the Aberdeen Impact Awards, run by the Aberdeen Council for Voluntary Organisations. And the chairman of the centre, Paul O'Connor, was recently awarded an MBE for his work within the community. But it runs a range of different classes, different projects, which are tailored to deliver on the community's behalf and is proving extremely popular. And I think these kind of operations where communities can take ownership of the programme, ownership of what is delivered, have a much more and are often much more aware of what the community is looking for than perhaps council officials are in terms of the programme that they would otherwise deliver. I see Margaret MacDonald wishes to intervene. I'll happily let her.
Margaret MacDonald. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I wonder if Mark MacDonald can say where these people came from, the Inchgarth. Were they there on the ground already? Had they previous experience? How was the team put together?
Mark MacDonald.
Indeed, it's one of it began very much from a group of committed individuals who used the centre, seeing the potential to do more with it. And that is the case, for example, in the Powys Community Centre in Aberdeen, where the previous management committee, who had essentially been there advising council officials, were then encouraged to take over the running of the community centre and are now delivering a much more vibrant programme, a much more fulfilling programme for the community than that which was being delivered by the council previously. It's taking that local knowledge, that local drive. But often you do need the volunteers to be there in place at the beginning, and it's about how we ensure that we have people in those communities who are either involved or willing to get involved. And I take the point that I think Margaret MacDonald was mentioning, is there is that issue around capacity building, and we do need to ensure that councils are building capacity within communities. The one note of caution I would strike in terms of the leased community centres is that, unfortunately, the local council administration have put letters out to them suggesting that if they don't sign up to new lease agreements, which are currently in the process of mediation, they will be evicted from the centres by the end of November. I think it's unfortunate that the council is putting those letters out before the process has reached its natural conclusion in terms of the mediation. Briefly on the issue of community gardens and also play areas, there's an extremely strong community garden in the village of Dice, in which I live and which I represented on the local council. One of my unfinished projects as a local councillor, because obviously I was then elected to this chamber, was to develop a community garden for the Bucksmount community. It's something I'm still keen to drive forward, looking to bring together the local community, the local council and other interested stakeholders. In terms of the play area issue, within Dice, the Community Council received a very generous grant to upgrade and introduce a path network in the Central Park area of Dice. They were fortunate enough to have some money left over from that and sought to look at where they could spend that more wisely. They spotted a play area within Dice which had fallen into some significant disrepair, and using the talents of a number of members of the local community council, of the community planning officer, and also seeking the views of the local community, they were able to develop that from a fairly ramshackle and disused play area into what is now probably an extremely vibrant and very well used play area. And I think that demonstrates sometimes that when we look at assets which the council holds, they are sometimes, because of budgetary constraints, etc., the council doesn't view them as a priority for upgrading. Local communities, if given the opportunity, if given the resource, can then take the initiative and develop these areas. And I think that these are examples which I hope the Minister will take on board, and I'll be happy to share more information with him if he would wish me to do so, in order that he can maybe look at these as ways to shape the bill going forward. But I think these are good examples, Presiding Officer, of how this bill can work, and I'll be very excited to see how the bill develops, because I think it does have an extremely exciting potential for Scotland's communities.
Thank you very much. I now call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome my opportunity to speak in the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill consultation debate. Given that the public consultation has been extended until the 26th of September, I hope that the debate today will generate ideas and inform the consultation process, and that they will then be included in the bill. The bill is intended to strengthen our communities and, where appropriate, allow the community to take over public assets, making them more receptive to the needs of the community and make use of vacant and unused properties in their areas to enhance their urban environment. Empowering and devolving certain powers to communities is long overdue. Ideas such as community right to buy, devolving certain budgets to communities, and giving them control of assets have been talked about for a long time, so I am pleased it is coming forward now. Currently, certain communities do attempt to improve the places they live in, yet they tend to find current legislation a hindrance rather than a help. So I welcome the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, if it can make the process easier and the correct checks and balances are included to enable communities to have the power, if they so wish, to improve their area, and they are protected if there should be any failure in the project. Volunteer Development Scotland are warning that we must be careful not to thrust too many powers onto communities that either don't want these powers or where they don't have the capacity to fully manage the powers. This would only serve to increase inequalities and burden our communities. Also, this bill must not be seen as a money-saving exercise of transferring assets to communities simply to remove them from the public service budgets. We need to get this right and not just half-heartedly put in place a range of measures with the aim of devolving powers to local communities and leave it at that. Instead, we must involve third sector bodies, voluntary organisations and all aspects of local authorities to work together to make sure that projects are sustainable. This is a key point. We must make sure projects are sustainable and consider what if a community project fails for whatever reason. For example, the community leader leaves the area. Will the asset revert back to the previous owner, or will it be sold on the open market, in which case there has to be robust measures in place to ensure there is no financial gain by individuals. We must also remember that communities differ all over Scotland, so any legislation dealing with the community empowerment must define exactly what is meant by community. Do we mean community councils, community associations and tenants associations? Or would any constituted group be allowed to take over an asset as long as it was a benefit to the community? So we need further clarity on this issue. For example, in North Ayrshire, we already have practical examples of communities working together and enhancing their urban and rural environments. The Pennyburn Regeneration Youth Development Enterprise, or PRIDE as it is known, brought the community together when it transformed a disused pub, the New Penny, into a youth drop-in centre. They had to acquire the building, get planning permission and obtain funding, as well as build capacity of volunteers. All of that took around 10 years. It has since opened and become a vibrant community hub, a community resource, instead of a vacant and run-down building which was an eyesore in the centre of their estate. Their success was more to do with the volunteers' determination rather than the help that they had from other agencies. It is also good to see that the paper talks about updating the allotment legislation, as in Kilbirnie, the Garnock Valley Allotment Association and the Eglinton Growers in Cowinning have shown that projects like these bring land into use which was otherwise lying vacant. We have already heard the benefits of allotments in promoting health and well-being, promoting sustainable communities and bringing communities together to grow healthy foods, which could then be put back into that community. So I welcome the idea that more land could be made available for allotments by using unused and underused public sector land, if that's what the community want. To conclude, we need to make sure we get this bill right and actually empower communities throughout Scotland. We can't allow this bill to either increase inequalities by shifting public assets to communities that don't want them, nor have the resources to manage them, or where it would not be sustainable. This idea could really breathe new life into communities by allowing them to decide what's best for them, based on local ingenuity and the availability of resources. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Bob Doris to be followed by George Adam.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to speak on the consultation debate for the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. If the Scottish Government gets this Community Empowerment Bill right, then I firmly believe that history will show that this piece of legislation could potentially be the most empowering law for local communities for many years. And it is only right that as Scotland quite rightly looks to seek more powers for herself, that we all look to see how we can give other powers direct to our communities. I want to use two local issues in Glasgow to highlight how this bill could empower Glaswegians and, quite frankly, ensure that councils across Scotland do better to ensure that real community planning takes effect locally and not just a tick-box exercise at the end of a process where decisions have already been taken. Community priorities put into place via real consultation at the start of a process, not at the end of it, to affirm local authorities' views, but they thought they knew best all along. So I tend to use two examples of where Glasgow City Council have not achieved a high standard at all, and hopefully show how this bill could help them do better in the future. In doing so, I do not intend to be simply negatively lambast the City Council and what I believe to be their shortcomings of the past, but rather pointers on how we can constructively work with them so they can do better in the future. The first example I would like to give, Presiding Officer, is to the 20-plus primary schools just a few years ago that Glasgow City Council closed. The issues with that are well documented. No real consultation process whatsoever. It was seen as a done deal. It was seen as a fait accompli. Indeed, the only reprieve from the mass school closure policy was Ruckhill Primary School, where the local authority actually forgot there was a co-located autism unit and they couldn't close the school because they left the autism unit sitting on its own. That got a reprieve ahead of a new campus opening a year or two later. And I don't want to open the can of worms of the right or wrongs of that, but what I would like to look at is what happened to the school estate that was closed. In most cases, the properties, the school estate was designated as surplus and those schools were demolished. In some cases, there was an option to transfer it to city properties, but more importantly, within the consultation document itself, at the outset of that process, it presupposed that these schools would be demolished. Where was the community empowerment in that? And let me give you an example of where they got it wrong. And one of the housing estates where two primary schools were closed was the Wynford estate in Maryhill. There was St Gregory's Primary and there was Wynford Primary. Both of these schools closed. Both were planned to be demolished. But such was the strength of the local campaign that after the closures, that the City Council decided to set up a task force for that area. And the outcome of that task force was that one of the schools was relaunched as a community hub. Indeed, it was nicknamed the Wynford Hub. Now, that is now run by Glasgow Community and Safety Services, and it provides some vital facilities for the local area. But if I'm being honest, Presiding Officer, it's limping along financially. It is not there financially. And I believe that's because it was done as an afterthought as part of the community planning process. I believe if community empowerment is to mean anything, that aspects of the school estate in terms of whether schools stay open or close or their uses changed should engage with the community at the outset, and that didn't happen in Glasgow. It may not happen in other local authorities, but this bill should ensure as a statutory duty that it does happen and it's real community empowerment. And where possible, let's not have Glasgow Community and Safety Services run a building, let's have it run and managed by the community themselves. So I think in terms of education, we can see where community empowerment is most definitely needed. Let me give another example in Glasgow. One of my local community centres, the Cadder Community Centre, I think all politicians would actually agree that it's been run down over many, many years. Firstly by Glasgow City Council and latterly by Glasgow Life, the Glasgow City Council arm's length organisation, when finally a few years ago it was deemed to close it, to lock the doors without any consultation, again as a fait accompli, there was a local campaign to save it. And I'm delighted to see the council did actually listen, but they listened at the end of the process, and I'm thankful to community campaigners and I'm thankful to Cadder Housing Association that took on the responsibility of running that building. Minister, the point I would make, if a community asset such as a community centre has been ran down in a planned fashion over 5, 10, 15 years, and that is why sometimes it is underutilised. Why does the community have to wait till a local authority puts a padlock on a door before it gets any right or say in taking it over? I believe if this community empowerment bill is to mean anything, a community should be able to say, we do not agree with the strategic plan for this community facility. We believe it is planned decline by the local authority, and we believe we should have a statutory right to be considered to take this over, and with funding to follow. And the point was made, this should not be about disposing of community assets as part of planned decline and planned de-investment by local authorities. So that is two aspects, Presiding Officer, that I actually believe are vital if local authorities are to get community empowerment and community planning right. In Glasgow, they haven't always got it right. I don't think they've not got it right because they don't want to. I just think there's a culture there, and that culture has to be supported to improve, and this community empowerment bill is the way to do it. And I would commend these considerations to the Minister as part of that consultation.
I now call George Adam to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate on this consultation. I won't try and say it because, as Margaret McDougall showed, it's quite a mouthful to say during the debate. But I will agree with Margaret McDougall when she says it is extremely important that we get this correct, because it's too important, because it can make such a radical difference in all our communities. I'll also come from a perspective similar to Anne McTaggart's, from a local authority point of view, because of my own personal experience within the Renfrewshire Council. But one thing I will say to all the members who have expressed some doubt over the consultation and where we're going with it, when Derek Mackay, the Minister, says, Presiding Officer, that potentially this is the biggest transfer of power since devolution itself, I can assure you he means it. Not just saying that as the Minister's pal on the back benches. I'm also saying it because I haven't worked with him for years and know that Derek Mackay is an individual who actually believes in getting facts, action and ensuring that we get results. So he is not one for dealing in hyperbole in general. My own time in local government showed me how important community empowerment was. And in particular, in Renfrewshire Council, we created the local area committees. And during that time, you had a situation as one of the conveners where you had to ensure that you had the community involved and wanting to actually turn up at your meetings. Now, it can become very dry, sitting there for 3 hours going through what is effectively a council meeting. But you had to make sure that people had the involvement and the vision was there. So we had the General Fund, Common Good Fund and various legacy funds. But without the vision and idea from the community, you had nothing, because once the money was gone, nobody would turn up. EastEnders and Coronation Street would win, and you'd be sitting in an empty council chamber with no one else to talk to. So what we had to do was ensure that we could get a vision and programme together. Now, one of the things we've talked about, and I've mentioned in the past, was an outdoor gym, £20,000 pensioners' play park. Now, that seemed silly at the start, but now it's used constantly. That same park had a tennis court that had not had investment for some time. We managed to get £220,000 from Tennis Scotland to ensure that young people in the south end of Paisley could play a sport that they would not have had access to before in the past. Now, that's what community empowerment is about, and it's not just about the councillors or the council telling, or politicians in general telling the public what to do, because you'll lose. It's like Margot MacDonald was trying to hint at earlier on. If you do not encourage the public and use their ideas, they'll walk away and they won't get involved. So it's about members of the public gaining that empowerment and thriving, and that's one of the things that I've always tried to push forward myself. Yes, I will.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was very impressed to hear that in Paisley they're playing tennis these days. It used to be TIG with Aches, they said. However, I would like to know who looks after the tennis facilities. Is there a council watchman? Is it the people themselves? Who looks after them?
George Adam.
I'm glad Ms MacDonald brought that up, because that was part of my speech I forgot to mention. I skipped that part there. But what I will say is that we had a plan to actually go beyond a stage 2, where we hope to get to a stage where we had the local tennis club and various other clubs in the area turn it into some form of hub where they could take control of it and eventually get further funding for a floodlit so it could be used during the winters as well. So, and also have a club house as well. So that was my idea for going for stage 2, and I think this bill, should we get it correct, would help with me to further that actual project itself. So that's one of the things that I'd be looking at as well. But one of the most important things I found out in my time in the council was community planning. And I think it's important that we make sure that there's further involvement with the communities, not just talking about public and private, also including the private sectors, finding common ground and working towards the greater good. One of my own debate last week about the Remshire Witches project of 1697 was about cultural planning, where they took an idea and developed it community-led, led by the actors. Everyone got involved and supported it. Extremely successful and can be used as a tool to regenerate various towns and areas in itself. And that's one of the things that I found extremely important, is that make sure that we get everyone involved in community planning. So one of the other things that really excites me about this is the possible ability of community compulsory purchase. I believe this could empower many groups within our community, as Sandra White's already said. In many of our constituencies, we know of town buildings and areas where we could actually do something better with them. They've lain there for years, there's nothing happened. They're either owned not by the local authority in a lot of cases, they're actually owned by private investors who have, because of various things in the economy or anything else, have left them or possibly stripped them to the bone. And I think in Paisley we have a number of examples, like the Territory Army building in the University District of Paisley and the part-time school which was part of the old Ferguson Cotton Mill. These are all things we could look at. One of the other projects we could look at as well, the Paisley Development Trust's ongoing work with the Russell Institute, a building provided to the people of Paisley by Mary Russell and eventually put to Glasgow NHS, Greater Glasgow NHS.
Member needs to start winding up.
Who have now pulled out, and the building is in a state of needing them to actually, they're trying to get involved. So in closing, Presiding Officer, if we are radical, we can really take some of our high street problems by the scruff of the neck and deal with the real issues. High streets with empty retail outlets, countless landlords sublet about 3 or 4 times, and get these buildings back into use. Of course, there needs to be a local vision and substantial plan for long-term gain, but the bill, I believe, could provide the actual foundations to encourage, engage and empower our communities.
I now call on Alison Johnson to be followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the opportunity to debate the community empowerment and renewal proposals at this early stage. I believe it helps encourage a wide range of views to be heard. By its nature, this debate cross-cuts policy and intersects with ongoing government work such as the recent Land Reform Review Group, the National Review of Town Centres, the Short Life Working Group on Community Councils, and the continued planning reforms. And many of these reviews and potential policy changes have the opportunity to work together in more coherent ways to make sure community empowerment isn't promoted by one and stifled by another. And I hope that we can come to a place where a coherent vision and framework arises. Yes,
Minister.
To give direct reassurance on that very point, in my ministerial portfolio, I'm involved with all those agendas to make sure that we do produce a strategic plan.
Alison.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important too, as Bob Doris mentioned, that we realise, I'd like to come to a place where it's accepted that the principles of decentralised powers are fully accepted, that this isn't just about decentralisation from Westminster to Holyrood, as Bob Doris mentioned, and I would go further with Bob Doris and ask that we lift the financial straitjacket that has been forced on to local authorities. I believe this financial freedom is vital because it's not empowerment to just give people a pot of money and say, there you go, spend it how you like. Empowerment does mean the ability to raise funds yourself and have the freedom to spend it on your own aims, financial independence at least to an extent. The consultation talks of participatory budgeting, an idea I fully support. In my region, the Leith Decides initiative allocated £16,000 worth of council funds through a highly successful participatory budgeting event. And I'd like to see the empowerment agenda explore how more tax-raising powers like allotment fees or parking charges could be devolved to community councils or neighbourhood partnerships, along, of course, with a concerted effort to build the capacity of this hyper-local democracy. On community asset transfer, I can't speak highly enough of the efforts of the Splashback Community Group. They're working to reopen Leith Waterworld, a unique asset in North Edinburgh, well suited to the young, old and those who are less mobile. and their bid to run the pool with the Council has been submitted, and City of Edinburgh Council will make a decision on September the 20th. It's a fine example of a community sports hub, if ever there was one, and one that surely meets all the criteria of a meaningful legacy of the great games we've all just witnessed. Also in Lothian region, another community, in this case track cyclists, have taken on the management and control of all cycling activities as well as equipment at Meadowbank Velodrome. And this illustrates an important point that communities of interest must be represented too in our plans for right to buy or asset transfer. The Common Ground Group has formed to help people explore the potential of community ownership of their local hill and woodlands in order to enhance and protect sites like Lothian's Craig House for future generations. In South Edinburgh too, local people who are tired of the loss of local shops steamrolled by the supermarket juggernaut are working to set up a community greengrocer, stocking it with produce from local allotments and gardens like the Royal Edinburgh Community Garden, which was once a stalled but is now a very abundant space. These groups are all working with other groups, from Senscot to Sport Scotland. They're all working with the Council to some extent. I agree with the Royal Town Planning Institute that a one-stop shop for best practice would be an invaluable aid, and with their call to help folk through existing mazes, not build more. And working with the groups I've mentioned has highlighted the need to ensure that communities have access to expertise in business planning and market research, for example. The consultation also talks of common good assets, and I believe there's a clear case for the creation of democratically controlled common good trusts with the scope to manage the transfer of assets to community control. Local energy has been mentioned a few times. If public sector land or roofing is available for renewable energy, the community should be able to work with the Council to create local energy companies to generate energy and revenue. I want to see our communities flourish, confident to take their own decisions, cohesive and equitable, so that everyone who needs it finds support within their community, resilient to shocks and changes that occur as part of changing environmental, social and economic circumstances. There's some focus in the introduction to the consultation on sustainable economic growth, but this won't, as an overriding purpose, create the kind of community development the bill describes. Opportunities for increased collective well-being come from letting communities decide what really matters to them and letting them act upon these decisions with appropriate support. In some cases, community needs will override the slavish and blind adherence to growth for growth's sake. A community might decide that it doesn't want to have a large-scale supermarket move into the area. It wants to keep existing local traders in business. They might decide they'd like a not-for-profit cafe rather than another clone town coffee shop. In summary, let's see communities fully involved in decisions that affect them, from local energy generation to the provision of local sports facilities. As we debate the future of Scotland, there couldn't be a better time to do so. Thank you.
I now call Margaret MacDonald. Ms MacDonald, I can give you 6 minutes.
That's a surprise, but thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I was very impressed by Mark MacDonald's speech. He just sounded like a good councillor. He sounded as though he knew what was going on in his patch. And I'm very glad that he's giving that information to the consultation. I hope the government will listen to it, because it sounded full of good sense rather than long-winded words. What, though, did Margaret McDougall do? Because I think she put the cat amongst the pigeons when she asked for the definition of a community. Because if you listen to some of the other very fine words and sentiments that were expressed, but we're going to embrace all sorts of communities in Scotland. Now, if a community pops up that you don't like in your area, are you going to be just as kind towards them? Are you going to look on them with such kindness? I say this from some bitter experience from many years ago, admittedly, trying to have a halfway house established in a leafier part of Edinburgh. And it wasn't particularly successful then. It's been easier now, but there are still lots of places where they would shy away from communities of people who had difficulties in life and who were trying to get back on board again. It's just one to think about what exactly is a community. What are we talking about when we talk about communities of interest, and how do they stack up alongside geographical or social communities? But anyway, let's go to the groups that call in our community assets or community good resources as mentioned by Margaret Mitchell and Sandra White. And I think we have to look at the way in which they are going to use the newfound power of control over these assets. And it was Alison Johnson who mentioned that they should think of trusts to transfer the powers to them. And I think that's a very sensible, down-to-earth suggestion. Once again, it's not airy-fairy, but it's got to be looked at in every circumstance to see if it works and suits the particular local community that it's rooted in. I had a part to play in the establishment of what I thought was an absolutely excellent community empowerment project in South Edinburgh, which has now been rolled out to another couple of examples of community flats. And the need was for basic living skills and lifestyle skills. I know it sounds a bit hame-knitted, but nobody could make a pot of soup amongst the young lasses who were given homes in the tower block and so on. And there were all sorts of things that people didn't know how to do that were basic and needed just basic home skills. And there were a lot of elderly women there, widows and so on, who had not all that much to do. And there were also men who could do stuff around the place. Cut a long story short, we got the council on board, we got the health board on board, we had a nurse seconded, we managed to get a flat, and we built the community flat. It was absolutely stowed out. And it was offering the sort of things that the council can't. It was offering anger management classes next door to the soup making. It was offering just a cup of tea when you needed it. It was a place where the community did mix and mingle, and where you began to it acted as a catalyst for further ideas that were put into effect. I'm not going to give evidence to you. I'm not going to give evidence to the Minister, so I'm not going to leave him with it. He knows enough about this, and it's on record at the Council if he wants to find out about these things. But that is the sort of empowerment that I'm interested in when we're talking about our poorest communities. Although I very much support what Bob Doris wants to see in his area, and I like the sound of what is happening in Paisley just now as regards the sport, because I think having a sports facility in your area that people get keen about and their kids are involved in and they look after, I think that is empowering for the community, but I don't think it actually involves the whole community. It does only involve the enthusiasts. Now, in this, I might be proved wrong, because you can look at the swimming pool in Stonehaven, where it was taken over as a locally managed venture, and it's very diverse in what it does, and it's very diverse in the groups in the community that it appeals to. But it's not just simple to say, if we have this facility, then we'll empower the community and things will get better for them. So therefore, I think we have to be flexible as regards the structure, and we've got to be very organised as regards training volunteers. You've got to work out how you're going to do it without patronising folk, but you need to train volunteers so that they're willing to step up to the plate, because if they're living in a depressed area, they're that bit scared of taking on debt and so on. They're scared of things like that. So you've got to train volunteers. And just before I sign off, I should let the Minister know that I am looking for some support for a project in Edinburgh which I think will empower the community. And that's the velodrome to which Alison Johnson referred. There are heaven knows how many young cyclists in Edinburgh training just now. They don't have a proper velodrome. We're not looking for one with bells and whistles such as they're going to have in Glasgow. That's fine. But what we need is a good working model for kids to learn and train. And it will be that there's a bit of money needed, not much, but a bit of money. We're also looking for a bit of money needed to put the paddle sports facility into Leith Docks, because if we don't, an area of regeneration will fail.
Ms MacDonald, you're going to have to close.
And I'm very grateful for having had the chance to tell the Minister. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
We now move to wind-up speeches. Jamie McGregor, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to close for the Scottish Conservatives. I thank those organisations that provided useful briefings for the debate, including Planning Aid for Scotland and the SCVO. There have been some good speeches from members on all sides, including my friend Margaret Mitchell, who laid out our general approach to the matters we're talking about. Our broad brush approach is that while we absolutely support the empowerment of communities and their renewal, we think that the argument is still to be conclusively made that these should be matters for legislation instead of strategic decision-making by government, backed with resources and practical assistance. Legislation empowering communities will not in itself result in the desired outcome. As I've indicated, there are many themes in the consultation document that the Scottish Conservatives are happy to support, and which we have heard of today are supported by members of all parties. Indeed, many of the themes also mirror those associated with the big society being promoted by the Prime Minister and the UK government. The big society, of course, consists of people who volunteer their time and effort to make things happen. Never has this been more evident than in the recent Olympic Games, where countless volunteers, or games makers, as they were called, took part in helping and guiding the athletes and visitors, and also taking part in the outstanding ceremonies which opened and closed both the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. It's interesting to note that many more people responded to the call for stewards than the call for just volunteers, which shows how vital it is to label voluntary positions correctly, giving people a far greater sense of achievement and value in what they are doing. Yes, I'll take the intervention.
Right, Mackenzie.
Would you agree with me that community activists and volunteers have been working for their communities long before David Cameron came up with the idea of the big society, and indeed the Olympic Games have been have been held all over the world very, very successfully long before David Cameron came up with the idea of the big society?
Jim McGregor.
Well, of course, that's absolutely true. Of course that's true. And I'll just move on from there. I was only pointing out that they were a successful Olympic Games and that David Cameron is a successful Prime Minister. But there we are. Let us hope the legacy of the volunteer spirit, having been rekindled, continues for many years to come. We agree that those delivering our public services must work with communities to design and deliver those services around the community's needs. That's something that should go without saying. We welcome the fact that ministers have said they wish to strengthen opportunities for communities to take independent action to achieve the goals they've decided they want to achieve. Like a number of other members, I'm also very positive about the role the third sector can play in community planning and delivering of local services. I think there's merit in the suggestion in the consultation document that each public sector authority is a named accountable officer who is responsible. We are also supportive of the concept of housing tenants engaging more with their local authority or registered social landlord. And like other members here today, we're positive about providing communities with space for allotments and community gardens, recognising that this can lead to better health through diet and exercise. And in terms of communities being able to make greater use of unused and unused properties, we would support practical proposals, but would want to see appropriate and genuine protection for the owners of private land who may wish to utilise it in a different way in the future. A number of members have taken the opportunity of today's debate to highlight examples of good practice in their constituencies and regions, and I would wish to do the same. Just last week, the small but vibrant community of Craignish in Argyll and Bute was commended in the community involvement category of the Scottish Awards for Quality in Planning for their community plan. The judges described their plan as an excellent example of how communities can work together to deliver a good quality land use plan for a small amount of resource. And I congratulate all of my constituents. It's not the first time I've congratulated the people who live in the Craignish Peninsula, including those in the Barbrek Glen, Cruve Haven, and of course Ardfern. It is one of the strongest communities in Argyll and Bute and has a volunteering ethos which is second to none. I would also want to pay tribute to the work of community councillors throughout my region, as Planning Aid for Scotland suggests community councils require support and training, as they are the only type of community group with a statutory role in the planning system. Our manifesto last year sought to boost the role of community councils by requiring local authorities to allocate a budget to them, proportionate to the size of the area they cover, so that they could undertake their own projects. Now, the Scottish Conservatives will encourage as many people as possible to make responses to the current consultation. We will assess the results of the consultation carefully and the subsequent draft bill that the ministers, of course, have pledged to bring forward. But ministers will have to ensure that at all times they are not simply just introducing more or disproportionate red tape, bureaucracy or regulatory burdens that only serve the purpose of disempowering communities and people. But to end on a more positive note, I was delighted to hear the Minister Mackay stressing the importance of enabling people to start and managing their own projects in their local communities. At least I think that's what I heard him say. And also to hear Mike Mackenzie's excellent point in his speech about practice being just as important as theory. And also Margaret MacDonald's point about soup, one of the most important things since the creation of penicillin.
Ms McGregor, thank you. I call on Sarah Bout. Ms Bout, you've got about 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a really good debate in the sense that it's demonstrated what a huge number of opportunities we can all see as representatives, not just in our own regions or constituencies, but across the country, that could come from this bill if we collectively get it right. So I think from that point of view, it's been very good. I think there have been a lot of very good examples of best practice in terms of community ownership and community management raised across the chamber. And if I was looking at my own region, I could talk at length about the experience of a local community sports facility that was built by the community. They did all the fundraising for it. They couldn't actually manage it successfully, though. It ended up going to the leisure company and the City Council, and now it's been passed back to a different community organisation, Basketball Scotland. And I think it's about getting all the experiences in the round. I think Alison Johnson talked about the need for marketing skills and financial skills. I think it's not just about the buildings, it is about the management. People have mentioned the issue about generating revenue. There are a whole set of complex skills depending how complex those projects are going to be. So that support is absolutely crucial. In my own constituency, I've seen the Back Greens initiative flourish in the backs of a mix of private and housing association tenemental property with previously land that was basically just left to rot, and it's now been transformed, it's been brought back into use, and it's now made those areas much more attractive. Again, there was an issue of management skills, external support, and a bit of finance to prime it. The Inch Park, formerly run by the council but now run by the local community, it again needed external support to make it work. I think the comments made by Margaret MacDonald about the velodrome in Edinburgh, she's now left, unfortunately. I was just going to congratulate her for raising the issue. It is a really good example of something that is now not fit for purpose, but would take a bit of investment to bring it up to scratch, but also to enable it to be managed thereafter. I think there are the volunteers. I think there are the people with skills. And I think in the context of building on the legacy of the Olympics, it's about better utilising land and building for activity, but it's also about thinking through the management issues because they're not always straightforward. And communities can be very good at raising funds. The skills of managing a project there afterwards and making it successful, that's another layer of additional experience. So one suggestion I'd have for the Minister that has been made to me by the Scottish Sports Association is that the Scottish Government itself could take a look at volunteering and how it as an organisation could facilitate volunteering and see that as a model that could then be used by other public sector organisations, but also the public sector, the private sector. I'm thinking about financial management skills, which might often be somebody's bread and butter skills in their day-to-day job, but in a local community that could be a vital skill that they simply can't afford to buy in. So I think it's about using those enthusiasms, using the experience and thinking about the human assets that we've got across the public sector and the national level and in the local level as well. Then there's national public sector assets, which hasn't been talked about very much. Alison Johnson mentioned the fantastic example of NHS Lothian transforming unused land into allotments, which is now benefiting patients and it's benefiting the local community. But the Health Board isn't keen to give that land away in perpetuity. They're happy to lease it. So I think the detail that the Minister is going to get, I hope, in response from the consultation is absolutely crucial, because short-term leases can suit public sector organisations where they have long-term aspirations for the land but not the short-term capacity to use the land, but it could be used by other people, such as allotments or community gardens. Longer-term leases, though, are absolutely crucial if community groups are going to attract lottery funding or trust funding, or they want to put investment on the ground. So I think thinking through the detail of leases is quite important, because they can be used in different circumstances and they can be used for different community groups. I can give you the current example of a no-win situation at the moment, where the Scottish Prison Service is about to sell off the Prison Officers Club at Saughton. It's a fantastic local club run by the prison officers for the local community and for prison officers, and it may be lost because the prison service is determined to sell the land to the highest bidder. And that, I think, is the kind of conflict that we have to be upfront with. There will be conflicts, whether it's at the national level or the local level. I hope this bill will actually set a different framework so that you'll be able to take a wider community interest or trade off some of those interests. I mean, it's been suggested to me at the council level that if we have somebody that's looking at assets, if the council is able to manage it, then they can think through the different category of assets. There might be some assets they want to sell to the highest bidder to reinvest in a wider level across the community, but there might be other assets that actually would be much more appropriate for community disposal or for community management. So I think the National Asset Register is actually a very good idea. I'm very keen to see it brought forward. I think community ownership and cooperatives are important models, and we wanted to add them to our debate today because we want to see an investment generating benefits locally so that you can capture that accountability and you can see the direct benefit. And colleagues across the chamber have talked about community trust models, renewables models. I want to put on the record that I think Cooperative Development Scotland could be a key agent in helping support communities and giving them the skills and expertise to mobilise and to maximise opportunities from land and buildings. Because one theme that's come across the chamber, I just want to finish this point, Margaret MacDonald, is that actually the detail and the complexity of trusts and the complexity of financial management is actually quite important to make sure the skills are available in the local communities. And that help has got to be there from the start. I'm happy to take the intervention.
Giving way. It's to probe further whether or not the cooperative movement in Scotland now can provide the training, the sort of training we need for local groups.
Sarah Boyack.
Well, I think there are some absolutely fantastic examples, particularly in the Highlands, where community renewables developments have been taken forward. Community Energy Scotland has been critical to that. The cooperative movement has also been supportive to that. So I actually think we've got some really good examples out there. But it is about having the financial management and things like risk management. If you're building renewables or you're taking over a building, there are health and safety issues. I think support for local communities is crucial. And I think, yes, that support is there, but it needs to be made available. And one of the things that was suggested is looking at guidance. I think that's something that might be worth looking at when the Minister is pulling together the different ideas. And one of the things I'd be keen to hear in his winding up speech is how the Minister thinks he's going to manage this consultation process. You've got opening up this extended process now. You'll report back in terms of the draft bill as it comes forward. The challenge, I think, in preparing for this debate, I suspect we've all found, is quite a short period of time to go through the key different sections in the bill. Each section in this bill could actually have generated quite a useful discussion this afternoon. So I think as a chamber and the committee, I think that point was made by Ad McTaggart, we need to think about how we break down this bill and make sure each section gets the debate it deserves. I therefore want to highlight the issue of dangerous buildings that was included in the consultation. Malcolm Chisholm mentioned it. It's both a controversial and a complex area. And one suggestion I would have to the Minister is that he gets his officials to explore why the provisions in the 2006 Act have not been used by local authorities. Before we bring in new legislation, I think that's a critical issue. Because I look at the issue in Edinburgh where we've had the statutory notices fiasco, where there are powers to take the money back. It's a really complex issue, and my constituents would like this issue explored in detail. I totally support the aims that David Stewart's got, but the detail's crucial. I think there have been some fantastic speeches this afternoon. Let's come back, let's debate this again. This is definitely not the last word on it. I was delighted to be in a formerly privately owned tavern last night in Newton Grange. Lord Lothian gave it back to the community. And I think let's not just look at the public sector in terms of community land disposal, let's also look at the private sector and see what they can bring to the table too. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call on Derek Mackay to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 4:59.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think this has been an excellent debate which has, as Sarah Boyack has said, raised the opportunities that now exist in terms of taking this bill forward. And through the consultation, there's been a range of methods in which we will continue to bring forward the ideas and the practicalities to ensure that this works. Sarah Boyack, I should say again that we will accept the Labour amendment, and I feel a closeness particularly with the Labour Party on this debate. Clearly the red tie is having more benefits than I first envisaged this morning. Can I say that there may be tough choices ahead because there are clear conflicts that could potentially arise in areas such as assets. But the reference group this morning, the parliamentary debate and the discussion being had in other places shows a great deal of enthusiasm for this bill, not just the legislative framework that could be produced, but guidance, best practice and resources that can be found to ensure that we meet the aspirations that have been outlined by many members today. And it is important we turn ambitions into reality and ensure that that is sustainable so that projects created through this work can survive and go forward. There's also further work to be carried out in relation to empty properties. And although there is not an immediate asset management account, Scottish Enterprise and others are working on a register of empty properties, and that's one such tool that can assist communities in identifying what's available. Claire Baker and Sarah Boyack raised a very important issue of inequality and ensuring that how these proposals being consulted upon are implemented doesn't make inequality worse, but tackles inequality. And I give you some reassurance that the membership of the reference group includes Oxfam, Shelter, Scottish Community Alliance, Poverty Truth Commission, Scottish Youth Parliament and many others. The membership alone doesn't itself tick a box, of course it doesn't, but it's to reassure you that much work will go on to ensure that the issues around inequality will be addressed. I think Annabel Ewing is right to be excited about this particular programme and these proposals, and she's right to identify the can-do spirit that this could encourage. In terms of empty and dangerous buildings, yes, there are aspects of this bill that could be progressed within that as well. Claire Baker said we should be sensible and proportionate, and Presiding Officer, that's absolutely correct, and also mentioned the potential of community energy projects, which we have lessons to learn from as well. You also referred to Council, the member also referred to Council decision-making, and as it affects individual local elected members, and I do want to engage with COSLA and councils further on the proposals therein. But Sandra White is an enthusiast for this programme for community empowerment, so much so that the launch of the consultation was in Sandra White's own constituency, which I know she warmly welcomed. Actually, a very good practical example of a facility going from council ownership towards community ownership. Malcolm Chisholm has made a substantial contribution, not just in this debate or as a minister or a member of the Scottish Parliament, but in so many other ways towards community empowerment. And of course we recognise that and want to build upon the best practice that was established by previous administrations and take on board the comments around state aid rules and best practice. But he makes a very helpful suggestion. We should have an online hub to promote best practice in terms of community-led projects. Well, we've created a new online hub some weeks ago, ourgreatideas.org. So we're ahead of you just in terms of that particular idea, and you identify some really good practice between the Labour SNP administration in Edinburgh, just as many other members have been able to identify great projects in their own area. And in relation to Dave Stewart's bill, we are considering that, but we believe there are a range of powers that could be considered with local government to tackle their enforcement powers in relation to private sector property that may have to be addressed. Alison McInnes was right to cover the Christie Commission and the important place that has within this debate, and also reassurance. You refer me to the Carnegie Trust, who are also members of the reference group. It is a rather large reference group, but we've made sure that all interests, including the private sector and the third sector, are represented to get this right, co-chaired by the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. But you're also right to say it's more than just legislation or regulation. It's the culture and the leadership and the practical support that can be provided to deliver community empowerment in the way that is suggested. And in terms of the planning system, of course there's a crossover in community planning and geographic planning as it affects local communities. But I would disagree on your perspective on police and fire reform. I do believe, from experience in local government and now as a minister, that the emerging accountability will be better than the previous arrangements that we had in relation to those services. I agree with Mike Mackenzie on the dedication of volunteers and a number of projects across his own constituency, some of which I was able to visit over the summer period. Anne McTaggart raised a question around the process, so there will be an ongoing debate, consultation, reference group. There's been roadshows with local government and others. The website packs were sent to community groups across the country to raise the concepts as proposed in this exploratory consultation. And of course, a further opportunity to review a draft bill when that's presented to this Parliament. And I too would commend the Glasgow Stalled Sites initiative for what it has achieved. And again, we want to replicate that kind of project across the country. But this is about resources and people, human and physical, and we must ensure that appropriate checks and balances are in place. Mark MacDonald, as always, raises some helpful suggestions, and Margaret McDougall contributed in a way that was also very helpful in identifying barriers that currently exist in some community asset transfers, and that's the kind of technical issues we want to explore to ensure we can remove any unnecessary barriers from the system. And we don't want to simply create burdens on community, but genuinely empower them in the way that Bob Doris has described. And you know, the difference is from the scenario that Bob Doris described, where sometimes a council can determine which assets they choose to dispose of. Sometimes it is the liabilities, sometimes it is the less attractive community facilities that may otherwise have been heading for demolition. This could be a step change in that process, where local communities could lead the process of transfer, and they determine that which is appropriate to be transferred as a local community project. George Adam raised the good practice and local area committee funding in Renfrewshire, and Alison Johnson raised a very important point about financial powers and how that should be addressed. And of course, Margot made a number of points and interventions, and a naked attempt of lobbying on her particular pet project, which I'll certainly pass on to the Sports Minister involved. In terms of Chick Brodie, he raised the question, how radical should this debate be? Well, I can say, yes, Chick, I want to set our people free through the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. Radical suggestions to change Scotland for the better. And he says we can have action now, we don't need to wait for legislative change. And he's absolutely right. There are many actions that can be taken now to empower communities, to standardise consultations and to transfer assets. And the views from the grassroots are so far very encouraging indeed. In terms of the Conservatives' contribution to the debate, I found it very disappointing indeed, in stark contrast to every other party in the chamber. We will require legislation and other measures. We do want to give the communities the tools to do the job, but this absolutely is not the big society. That would be the kiss of death for any proposals in Scotland. Whereas for the Conservatives in England, big society means you are on your own, whereas for us, community empowerment means we will give you the tools to do the job. Genuine empowerment, and I think I'm reaching the end of this contribution. A genuine attempt to empower communities, listening to people as a listening government. And finally, just as we believe as a Parliament and as a government that the people of Scotland are best placed to take decisions about their future, so too it is local communities who are best placed to take decisions about their future. Raising ambitions for Scotland, realigning resources, removing barriers, unlocking potential, delivering new powers and new rights to local communities in a way that we haven't been able to do before. Unlocking human potential towards a renewed democracy. And of course, there's more to this than just finance, but general well-being. We support the principle of subsidiarity And just as we want to see powers come from London to Edinburgh, so too transfer more to local communities in the spirit of this debate. Because this represents, as a Parliament, the biggest potential transfer of power since devolution itself to local communities. And if this is what we can do with devolution, just imagine what we could do with independence.
That concludes the debate on the consultation on the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewable. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 4071 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to the business programme for Thursday the 13th of September. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 4071.
And in moving the motion, Presiding Officer, I'd like to bring attention to the Chamber that, as agreed at the Bureau yesterday, we've changed to Thursday's business with the insertion of a ministerial statement on the Renewables Obligation Scotland review announcement.
No member is asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 4071 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 4070 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 4070.
Formally moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 4070 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 4072 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 2 timetable. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 4072.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 4072 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4061.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack, which seeks to amend motion number 4061 in the name of Derek Mackay on the consultation on the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewable Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4061.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack is as follows. Yes, 108. No, 0. There were 12 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4061.1 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, which seeks to move motion number 4061 in the name of Derek Mackay on the consultation on the proposed Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4061.1 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is as follows. Yes, 18. No, 66. There were 36 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4061 in the name of Derek Mackay, as amended by the amendment in the name of Sarah Boyack, on the consultation on the proposed community empowerment and renewable be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 4061 in the name of Derek Mackay, as amended by Sarah Boyack, is as follows. Order. Yes, 107. No, 0. There were 12 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber, please do so quickly and quietly.